Imagine stepping onto a first-class flight, ticket in hand, only to be told, you don't belong here. That's exactly what happened to a young boy on Liberty Airways. But what started as one moment of injustice turned into a battle that shook an entire industry. A father's power, a system's resistance, and a fight that was far from over. You won't believe how it all ends. Stay with us. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Ezra Whitmore had always known that his family was different. Not in the way some kids at school thought, where wealth meant an easy life, but in the way his father, Walter Whitmore, had taught him. Money could open doors, but it didn't erase the way people saw you, or the assumptions they made before you even said a word. And at 12 years old, Ezra was beginning to understand that lesson in ways he hadn't before. Today was supposed to be special. His first time flying first class, and on Liberty Airways no less. A name his father had spoken about often, mostly in meetings he wasn't supposed to overhear. It was a business trip, but Walter had let him tag along. "It's time you saw how the world works, Ezra," he had said. At JFK Airport, the first-class lounge was a world of its own. Plush leather seats, attendants refilling drinks before glasses were even half empty, and a quiet hum of conversation from people dressed in suits that cost more than Ezra's entire closet. Walter was off in the corner, standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in a low, firm voice. Ezra sat stiffly on one of the chairs, gripping his boarding pass. His name, seat number, and the words first class were printed clearly, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to check it again, just in case. When an announcement came over the speakers calling for first-class boarding, Walter glanced at him. "Go on ahead," he said, covering the phone's mic. "I'll be right behind you." Ezra hesitated, but his father cut him a look. Not a harsh one, but the kind that told him to trust what he was saying. "You'll be fine," Walter assured him. Ezra swallowed hard, adjusted his backpack, and made his way toward the gate. The moment he stepped onto the plane, the difference was obvious. The first-class cabin was separated by a curtain, a space so quiet it almost felt sacred. The seats were wide, more like personal pods than chairs, with glowing screens and blankets folded neatly atop them. A few passengers were already seated, sipping champagne or reading newspapers. The air smelled of fresh linen and something citrusy. Ezra walked carefully down the aisle, his sneakers barely making a sound against the carpet. When he reached his seat, 4A, he let out a slow breath and climbed in, setting his backpack down. The seat controls confused him, and he spent a few seconds adjusting buttons before settling in. As he looked around, he noticed the stares. Not from everyone, but from enough people. A man in a business suit gave him a brief, questioning glance before returning to his newspaper. A woman, older, with pearls around her neck, kept looking at him over the rim of her reading glasses. Ezra shifted in his seat. He wanted to tell himself he was imagining it, but he wasn't. Then came the voice. "Excuse me." He looked up. The woman standing before him wasn't a passenger. She was older, maybe in her late 40s, her blonde hair pulled back into a precise bun. The navy blue uniform she wore was crisp, the name tag pinned neatly to her chest, reading Charlotte Kramer. She wasn't smiling. "Are you lost?" she asked, her tone polite but cool. Ezra blinked. "No," he said, quickly pulling out his boarding pass. "This is my seat." Charlotte didn't even glance at the pass. She simply tilted her head, a thin line forming between her brows. "Are you traveling alone?" "My dad's right behind me," Ezra answered, suddenly feeling smaller in the oversized seat. Charlotte exhaled, short and sharp. "And where is your father seated?" Ezra hesitated, glancing toward the entrance of the cabin, expecting to see Walter appear any second now. But he wasn't there yet. Before he could answer, Charlotte took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Look, sweetheart," she said, her tone softening, but in a way that made Ezra's stomach twist. "This section is for first-class passengers. Maybe you're supposed to be in economy?" Ezra's hands tightened around the armrest. "I am in first class," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have a ticket." Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line. There was no immediate accusation, no outright hostility, but there was something worse, doubt. The kind of doubt that made his skin crawl, the kind that told him she had already decided he didn't belong. She turned slightly, catching the eye of another flight attendant nearby. The woman gave her a questioning look, and Charlotte, with barely a flick of her head, motioned for her to come over. Ezra felt his chest tighten. The murmurs had started. The businessman from earlier lowered his newspaper just slightly, his eyes flicking toward the scene unfolding in front of him. The woman with the pearls whispered something to the man beside her. Ezra's face burned. Charlotte crossed her arms. "I'm just going to double-check something," she said, already reaching for her radio. "Double-check what?" Ezra asked, but she wasn't listening anymore. Through the gap in the curtain, he finally saw his father step onto the plane. Walter was still adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket, his expression unreadable, until his eyes landed on Ezra. Then his gaze flicked to Charlotte. Something changed in his face. Charlotte lifted the radio to her lips. Ezra's heart pounded. "Security," she said. "I need an escort to first class. We have a passenger who may not be in the right seat." Ezra's fingers tightened around the armrest. His pulse pounded in his ears, loud enough that he barely registered the shifting murmurs around him. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but he kept his face neutral. He had learned a long time ago that showing too much emotion could make things worse. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the boarding pass, holding it up for Charlotte to see. "This is my seat," he said, his voice measured. "I'm supposed to be here." Charlotte's eyes flicked to the paper in his hand, but she didn't lean in to examine it. Instead, she gave him another long, assessing look, as if the answer to her doubts wasn't printed clearly in black ink, but in his skin, his posture, the very fact that he was there at all. "Are you sure?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "That ticket could belong to someone else." Ezra's stomach clenched. The first-class cabin was still relatively quiet, but the tension in the air was thick now, like a low, rolling storm cloud. A man sitting 2 rows ahead, a middle-aged businessman with silver hair and a tailored navy suit, lowered his newspaper slightly, glancing over the edge. A woman with diamond earrings and an expensive silk scarf folded her arms, observing the interaction with the kind of detached curiosity that made Ezra feel like an exhibit behind glass. He swallowed hard. "My dad booked this seat for me," Ezra said, trying to keep his voice steady. "He's right behind me. He'll be here soon." Charlotte raised a skeptical brow. "And your father's name?" "Walter Whitmore." A flicker of something crossed her face. Recognition, maybe. But it was gone so fast Ezra wasn't sure he hadn't imagined it. Still, she didn't back down. "I see," she said, her voice polite but firm. Then, without so much as another glance at his ticket, she turned slightly and gestured toward the front of the cabin. A young male flight attendant, maybe in his late 20s, hesitated before stepping forward. His uniform was neat, his posture stiff, but his eyes darted between Ezra and Charlotte uncertainly, as if he wasn't sure what he had just walked into. "Daniel, would you please verify this young man's seat assignment?" Ezra's jaw clenched. "It's already verified," he muttered, barely loud enough for her to hear. If she did, she ignored it. Daniel glanced at Ezra, then at Charlotte, then back at Ezra. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, shifting awkwardly. He started, then hesitated. "I can check with the gate agent if needed." Charlotte gave a tight-lipped smile. "That won't be necessary." Then into her radio she spoke clearly, with the same calm efficiency one might use to request an extra blanket. "I need security in first class. We have a passenger who may be in the wrong seat." Ezra's breath hitched. Wrong seat. His vision tunneled slightly, the low hum of the airplane's ventilation system suddenly louder than everything else. A movement near the front of the plane caught his eye. His father had stepped on board, adjusting his cufflinks, scanning the rows as he walked. For a brief, foolish moment, Ezra felt relief. Then Charlotte turned to him, an unmistakable finality in her voice. "You need to come with me." Ezra barely had time to react before she stepped aside, making room for the 2 security officers now approaching from the galley. Everything seemed to slow down. The businessman with the newspaper let out a quiet sigh, folding the paper and setting it down. The woman with the scarf exchanged a look with her companion. A murmur rippled through the cabin, low, restrained, but impossible to ignore. Ezra wanted to argue, to push back, but his throat felt tight, his body frozen in place. Then one of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, spoke. "Sir, please come with us." Ezra looked at him, at the polished badge clipped to his chest, and knew instinctively that if he resisted, if he so much as hesitated, the situation would only get worse. So he moved. He slid out of the seat, stepping carefully into the aisle, his hands at his sides. His backpack remained on the floor by his seat. He wasn't even sure if he should reach for it. As he was led past the other passengers, the weight of their eyes followed him. Near the back of first class, someone muttered, "I told you," probably snuck in. Ezra's chest burned. A second later, another voice, soft, uncertain, broke through. "Wait," the young flight attendant, Daniel, said. "Maybe we should double-check." Charlotte cut him off smoothly. "The matter is being handled." The officers guided Ezra through the curtain, out of the first-class cabin, down the jet bridge. Each step felt heavier than the last, like wading through cement. Then, "Ezra!" He turned at the sound of his father's voice. Walter Whitmore stood just inside the aircraft's entrance, his expression unreadable. The only indication of his emotions was the slight narrowing of his eyes, the way his shoulders squared. One of the officers hesitated, as if suddenly aware of the name on their security log. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said, clearing his throat, "there was a misunderstanding with your son's seat." Walter barely acknowledged him. His focus was entirely on Ezra, his gaze sweeping over him in a silent assessment. Then finally he looked at Charlotte. The silence stretched, thick with something unspoken. Charlotte met his gaze but didn't speak. If she was surprised, she didn't show it. Walter exhaled slowly, deliberately. Then with perfect calm, he adjusted the cuff of his jacket. Ezra recognized the expression on his father's face immediately. Walter Whitmore was not a man who raised his voice. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, almost casual. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, as if testing the weight of the word. He glanced down at his watch. Then he looked back up at Charlotte. "I assume you can explain?" Ezra's feet barely touched the ground as the security officers led him through the narrow aisle. He wasn't being dragged, but the firm grip on his arm made it clear. This wasn't optional. His ears burned, his chest tightened, and the whispers behind him felt sharper than any insult he'd ever heard. The passengers in first class had already moved on, returning to their drinks, their conversations, their comfortable seats. But as he passed into the economy section, the reactions were different. People craned their necks, some confused, some indifferent, and a few with looks that told him exactly what they were thinking. He kept his head down, biting the inside of his cheek. The last thing he wanted was to cry. Lisa Moreno, one of the younger flight attendants, stood near the galley, clutching a stack of napkins like she didn't know what to do with them. Her brown eyes flickered with uncertainty. For a second, it seemed like she might say something, but then she looked past him at Charlotte, who walked just a few steps behind. Ezra saw it all happen in real time. Lisa's hesitation, the way her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She wouldn't argue. Charlotte's authority was absolute, and everyone knew it. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel something bubbling inside him, something hot and unfamiliar. A tight coil of anger mixed with humiliation. Had they even checked his ticket? Had anyone actually looked? The exit loomed ahead, the bright light of the jet bridge spilling in. One of the security officers reached for the door handle. "Might want to call the gate," the other officer muttered to Charlotte. "Confirm the kid's status before we—" "He's in the wrong place," Charlotte interrupted, her tone clipped. "That's all the confirmation I need." Ezra bit down on his tongue. He wanted to say something, to yell, to demand why she wouldn't just look at the proof in his pocket. But the words stuck in his throat, caught in that terrible space between frustration and fear. The door swung open, and standing just outside, calm as ever, was Walter Whitmore. For a second, Ezra wasn't sure what he expected from his father. A look of concern, maybe. An expression of shock. Instead, Walter's face was unreadable, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before him with practiced control. One of the officers straightened slightly. "Mr. Whitmore?" Walter didn't acknowledge him. His gaze flicked from Ezra to Charlotte, his expression as unreadable as ever. Ezra wasn't sure what his father was thinking, but he recognized something in his stance, in the deliberate way he exhaled. His father was many things, but he was never reactionary. He never raised his voice. He never rushed, which in some ways was far more terrifying. Walter finally spoke, his tone measured. Would someone like to explain why my son is being escorted off this aircraft? Charlotte stepped forward, maintaining the same polite detachment she had used with Ezra. There was confusion regarding his seat assignment, she said. Given the circumstances, I thought it best to verify. Verify what? Walter interrupted smoothly. Charlotte hesitated only for a second. We have strict guidelines about unaccompanied minors in first class. Ezra's hands curled into fists. I'm not unaccompanied, he muttered. Walter turned to him. Did they check your ticket? Ezra shook his head. They didn't even look. Something in Walter's expression shifted. It was subtle, the briefest narrowing of his gaze, the slightest tension in his jaw. He looked back at Charlotte. Is that true? Charlotte straightened, standing firm. I acted according to protocol. Walter's lips pressed together in something that wasn't quite a smile. Your protocol doesn't involve checking tickets? Silence. One of the security officers shifted uncomfortably. The young flight attendant, Lisa, was staring at the floor. Walter sighed, rubbing his temple as if the situation exhausted him. Very well, he said. Then in one smooth motion, he pulled his phone from his pocket and started typing. Charlotte frowned. Sir, there's no need. Walter held up a hand. I'm not speaking to you, he said, his voice still maddeningly calm. He glanced at the officer closest to Ezra. Release him. The officer hesitated, but only for a moment before stepping back. Ezra let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Walter finished typing his message and put his phone away. Then he turned to Charlotte. Tell me, he said, his voice light, almost conversational. How often do you find yourself in situations like this? Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Walter tilted his head slightly. You said you followed protocol, so I assume this is standard for you? Lisa looked up sharply, her hands tightening around the stack of napkins. Her lips parted slightly, like she was about to say something. Charlotte hesitated. She began, but Walter didn't let her finish. I'll be reviewing that protocol, he said, personally. Ezra watched as something flickered in Charlotte's eyes. It wasn't fear, not quite, but it was something close. Walter smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I assume there won't be an issue returning to our seats? Charlotte opened her mouth, then closed it. Finally, she took a step back. No issue at all, she said stiffly. Lisa took a breath, then finally moved. She stepped forward, pressing a small plastic cup of water into Ezra's hand. I'm sorry, she whispered. This isn't the first time. Ezra's fingers tightened around the cup. He looked up at his father. Walter was already watching him, studying him in that way he did when he wanted to gauge where Ezra's mind was. Ezra swallowed hard, then turned back to Lisa. What do you mean? Lisa hesitated, glancing at Charlotte, then at Walter. Walter exhaled, slow and deliberate. We'll discuss it later, he said. Ezra nodded, but something in his chest felt heavier now. He wasn't just upset, he was curious. Walter Whitmore had boarded this flight expecting a smooth journey, a routine trip, but as he settled into his first-class seat, his mind wasn't on business anymore. He wasn't thinking about his scheduled meetings or the deals waiting for him in Los Angeles. His focus had narrowed to one thing, what had just happened to his son. He adjusted his cufflinks with precision, but it was purely out of habit. His posture was as composed as ever, but inside something burned slow and steady. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating with men who prided themselves on keeping their biases hidden behind polished smiles. He knew how to read between the lines, and he had seen it in Charlotte Kramer's eyes. The quiet certainty that she had the power in that moment, that she had the right to decide whether Ezra belonged. Walter wasn't a man who reacted impulsively. He built his strategies like a chess player, always thinking 3-4 moves ahead. So while the flight attendants returned to their tasks and the passengers pretended not to have witnessed the scene, Walter reached into his briefcase and pulled out his tablet. He connected to the plane's secure Wi-Fi, his fingers moving swiftly across the screen. Liberty Airways had a vast internal network, But Walter had access most people didn't. His investments in the company ensured that. A few keystrokes later, he was inside the system, sifting through reports that most executives barely glanced at. Complaint logs, customer feedback, incident reports. He filtered the results. Race-based discrimination complaints. The numbers loaded within seconds. Walter exhaled slowly. The statistics were staggering. Complaints from black passengers about poor treatment were 3 times higher than those from white passengers. Cases where customers reported being denied upgrades or questioned about their seating assignments, far more frequent for travelers of color. A pattern of complaints about subtle but consistent disparities in service, all brushed aside with generic, dismissive responses. But the real revelation came when he scrolled further. An internal service policy directive, buried deep in the archives, outlined an unspoken standard for preserving the first-class experience. The wording was careful, deliberately vague, but it was clear as day to a man like Walter. Liberty Airways had an unofficial, preferred clientele, and that clientele did not include people who looked like his son. He clenched his jaw, his grip tightening around the tablet. This wasn't just about Charlotte Kramer. It was bigger. Walter was still staring at the screen when a voice broke through his thoughts. "Dad?" Ezra's voice was quieter than usual. Walter turned to see his son slouch slightly in his seat, his posture closed off, fingers fidgeting against his pant leg. The boy's usual spark, his quiet confidence, was dimmed. Walter studied him for a long moment before speaking. "There's a question you need to ask yourself, Ezra." Ezra looked up, confused. "What?" Walter leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "What do you want to do about this?" Ezra blinked. He hesitated. "I don't know." Walter nodded, as if he expected that answer. "It's not enough to be angry," he continued. "Anger fades. The question is, what comes next?" Ezra swallowed. He knew his father wasn't just talking about the flight. For years, Walter had been preparing him for moments like this, for a world that would not always welcome him with open arms, despite his last name, despite his privilege. Ezra had thought he understood, but now he wasn't sure he did. The frustration in his chest twisted into something heavier. "I don't want this to happen to someone else," he muttered. Walter studied him for a beat, then nodded. "Good." The conversation could have ended there, but before either of them could say more, a shadow passed over their seats. Ezra looked up. Lisa Moreno. The young flight attendant glanced over her shoulder before leaning in slightly, lowering her voice. "If you really want to know," she murmured, "I can tell you what I've seen." Walter's expression didn't change, but Ezra could sense his father's full attention shift toward her. Lisa hesitated, then exhaled, glancing toward the front of the cabin where Charlotte was speaking with another passenger. "This isn't the first time," she said softly. "Passengers like your son, they get treated differently. Not always like this, not always so obvious, but it happens." Walter tapped his fingers against his armrest, his gaze unreadable. "Why tell me?" he asked. Lisa hesitated again before meeting his eyes. "Because I'm tired of pretending I don't see it," she admitted. Ezra watched his father nod slightly, as if filing away that information for later. "Can you prove it?" Walter asked. Lisa swallowed. "I can tell you what I know. I can show you records of incidents that were ignored." Walter sat back, his expression thoughtful. Ezra, meanwhile, felt something shift inside him. All his life, his father had told him that power wasn't just about what you had, it was about how you used it. Ezra felt the weight of what that truly meant. He wasn't just upset, he was ready to do something about it. Walter turned toward the window, the cold city lights of New York disappearing as the plane ascended. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "All right," he murmured, "let's show them they made a mistake." Lisa Moreno hesitated. She stood near Walter's seat, her hands gripping the hem of her uniform as if she was still debating whether to speak at all. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, blending with the quiet chatter of passengers who had already moved on from the earlier scene. But Walter hadn't moved on, neither had Ezra. The young flight attendant took a deep breath, then leaned in slightly. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter's fingers remained poised over his laptop keyboard, but his attention was now solely on her. He didn't react outwardly, just nodded for her to continue. Lisa glanced over her shoulder as if making sure Charlotte wasn't watching. Then she lowered her voice further. I've seen passengers, mostly black, but sometimes Hispanic or Middle Eastern, get questioned about their seats more often than others, she said. Even if they have the right ticket, even if their names are on the manifest. It's like there's always this extra layer of suspicion. Ezra, listening quietly, clenched his hands together. Lisa exhaled sharply. And upgrades? Don't even get me started. There have been times when I've seen passengers with elite status get passed over, while someone else, someone who fits the right image, gets an automatic bump to first class. Walter didn't blink. And these decisions, are they coming from the top, or are they just cultural within the staff? Lisa hesitated. That's the thing. It's never explicitly stated. But people like Charlotte. She paused, flicking her eyes toward the front of the cabin where the senior flight attendant was speaking with another crew member. They enforce these unwritten rules, and no one questions them, at least not if they want to keep their jobs. Ezra felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Walter leaned back slightly, his gaze dropping to the laptop screen in front of him. Numbers, spreadsheets, and policies filled the display, each piece of data confirming what Lisa had just said. The complaints about customer service discrepancies weren't just an accident. They weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern. Walter exhaled slowly. Then, with quiet precision, he began typing. Ezra watched as his father pulled up an encrypted messaging app and sent a single text to someone labeled only as R. Johnson. Need records. Full scope. No redactions. A reply came within seconds. You're sure? Walter's fingers hovered over the keyboard for half a beat before he responded. Absolutely. Lisa watched the exchange, her brow furrowed. What are you doing? Walter didn't look away from the screen. Making sure this isn't swept under the rug. His tone was calm, but Ezra could hear the edge beneath it, the quiet, simmering certainty that meant his father had already made up his mind. Lisa hesitated again, then gave a small nod. I'll help however I can, she said. Then, with a quick glance to make sure no one else was watching, she slipped away down the aisle. Ezra let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Walter, however, wasn't finished. His next move was swift and deliberate. An email drafted in seconds, sent directly to the executive team at Liberty Airways. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but a demand for transparency. A call for an urgent review of service policies. A notice that he was looking closely. Ezra sat back in his seat, watching his father work. For years he had admired Walter's control, his ability to navigate the world of business with quiet authority. But now, watching him move with such purpose, Ezra saw something different. This wasn't just about business. This was personal. Ezra felt something shift inside himself. He had always believed that if he just worked hard enough, if he dressed the right way, spoke the right way, proved himself enough, people would accept him. But that wasn't the truth. No matter how much he tried to blend in, there would always be people like Charlotte Kramer who saw him as an outsider. And that thought, it made him angry. But this time he didn't push it down. Instead, he let it settle, let it fuel him. Walter finally closed his laptop and turned to him, studying his expression carefully. Ezra, he said, his voice steady, are you ready for people to know what happened? Ezra met his father's gaze. He didn't hesitate. Yes. He felt like his voice actually mattered. Walter adjusted his cuffs with practiced ease, his expression unreadable, as he leaned back in his seat. The hum of the airplane's engines filled the space between him and Charlotte Kramer, who sat stiffly across from him in an empty first-class seat. She had come reluctantly, her posture tight, her lips pressed into a firm line. Walter had made the request simple, a private conversation, no audience, no distractions, just the two of them. Charlotte had agreed, but her confidence had not wavered, not yet. You requested to speak with me, Mr. Whitmore? She said, her voice smooth, professional. Walter studied her for a moment before speaking. I did, he said evenly. I wanted to offer you an opportunity, a chance to explain your actions before I take the next step. Charlotte's fingers twitched, barely noticeable, but Walter caught it. I was following protocol, she replied, as I've already stated. Walter nodded as if considering her words. Then he reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, tapping the screen casually. I assume you're aware that Liberty Airways has an internal complaint system, he said, designed to track passenger service concerns. That data is accessible to executives and certain investors. Charlotte's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Walter tilted the phone toward her, revealing a page of statistics. Would you like to guess what these numbers represent? He asked. Or should I save you the trouble? Her silence was answer enough. This, Walter continued, tapping the screen, is a breakdown of customer complaints over the past 5 years, complaints specifically related to discrimination or unequal treatment. Now here's the interesting part. He swiped the screen, scrolling down. A pattern emerges when we separate complaints involving first-class passengers of color. They're 3 times more likely to report being questioned about their seats, 4 times more likely to be denied an upgrade, even with qualifying points. And in the cases where staff intervention was required, do you know what name comes up the most? He glanced at her, letting the weight of his words settle. Charlotte's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Walter leaned in slightly. It's yours. A beat of silence stretched between them. Charlotte's mask of professionalism faltered just enough for Walter to see past it. She inhaled, deep and measured, before speaking again. If you're implying that I acted out of bias, I'm not implying anything, Walter cut in. I'm stating it outright, and I want to hear you say it. Charlotte hesitated. Her gaze flickered toward the front of the cabin, where Lisa Moreno was serving drinks, where other passengers carried on as if nothing was happening. Walter let the silence stretch, waiting. Finally, Charlotte exhaled sharply. I followed the procedures we were trained on, she admitted. It's how things have always been done. People like you, she caught herself correcting, passengers like your son, they raise suspicions. Whether you want to admit it or not, that's the reality. Walter didn't blink. He tapped his phone screen again, activating the recorder. Would you mind repeating that? Charlotte's eyes widened, her face paling. You recorded me? She hissed, her composure slipping. Walter's expression was cold. I make it a habit to document the truth. Charlotte's breathing quickened, her fingers curling into fists. You can't prove anything, she spat. You think you can change the way things work in this industry? You think people like me are the problem? You're wrong, Mr. Whitmore. This is bigger than me, bigger than you. Walter's gaze sharpened. I know exactly how big it is, he said. That's why I'm not stopping here. The tension between them was thick, heavy, unspoken truths hanging in the air. Then from a few rows behind them, a voice broke the silence. Did you just say that out loud? Both Walter and Charlotte turned. A man, a middle-aged traveler in a business suit, had been sitting nearby, listening. And he wasn't alone. A few other passengers had turned in their seats, murmuring, their expressions shifting. One woman, holding her phone discreetly, was already typing something. Charlotte's face went pale. Walter smiled, slow and knowing. Looks like we have an audience. Charlotte's breath came unevenly. You're making a mistake, she whispered. Walter slipped his phone back into his pocket, eyes locked on her. No, he said simply. You did. The buzz of a notification vibrated against his palm. He glanced at his phone, a message from his assistant. Call me, this is going viral. Walter turned to Ezra, who had been watching everything unfold in silence. The boy's hands were clenched into fists, but his gaze was steady. This isn't going to go away, is it? Ezra asked quietly. Walter's lips curved slightly. No, he said, not this time. Ezra exhaled, long and slow. Good, he muttered, because I don't want it to. Walter studied him for a moment before nodding. Then let's get ready, he said, because this is just the beginning. As the plane cruised steadily through the sky, the storm brewing below had only just begun. The moment the plane touched down at LAX, Walter's phone vibrated with an incoming call. He didn't need to check the screen to know who it was. The higher-ups at Liberty Airways had seen the firestorm brewing online, and now they wanted to get ahead of it. As passengers around them unbuckled their seatbelts and reached for their luggage, Walter remained still. He glanced at Ezra, who sat beside him, staring out the window. The boy's fingers tapped rhythmically against his knee, his mind clearly racing. Walter finally exhaled and answered. "Mr. Whitmore," a carefully controlled voice greeted him. "Richard Coleman would like to speak with you immediately. We've arranged a car to take you to our headquarters." Walter didn't bother responding right away. He leaned toward Ezra, voice low. "Do you want to come?" Ezra turned, surprised. "I can?" Walter nodded. "You should see what happens next." The boy hesitated only for a moment before giving a firm nod. Walter brought the phone back to his ear. "We'll be there." The drive to Liberty Airways headquarters was silent. Outside, Los Angeles shimmered under the midday sun. But inside the car, the weight of what was happening pressed down on both of them. Ezra had never been to a meeting like this before. He wasn't sure what to expect. But when they arrived, he realized one thing immediately. His father was walking into enemy territory. The boardroom was sleek, all glass and polished wood, with a long table stretching the length of the room. Several men and women in tailored suits were already seated, and at the head of the table sat Richard Coleman, the CEO of Liberty Airways. A man in his mid-50s, he looked as if he'd spent years perfecting the art of appearing approachable without ever truly being so. Walter entered the room with the same measured calm he always carried, and Ezra followed, standing just a step behind him. Coleman gestured to a chair. "Walter, please sit." Walter didn't. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, setting it down in the center of the table. "This," he said evenly, "is what I know." No one moved at first. Coleman exchanged a glance with a man sitting to his right, then finally reached for the folder. He flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages inside. "What is this supposed to be?" Walter leaned slightly forward, voice steady. "A detailed breakdown of the discriminatory service patterns within your airline. Complaints that were filed and ignored. Passengers who were denied services based on racial bias. A system designed to protect the traditional clientele of first class." Coleman let out a slow breath, closing the folder as if it weighed more than he expected. "Walter, this was an unfortunate situation." Walter cut him off. It was a predictable one, and not the first. A murmur passed between the other executives. A woman near the end of the table shifted uncomfortably. A man in a Navy suit cleared his throat but didn't speak. Coleman tried again. "We are, of course, deeply sorry for what your son experienced." Walter's smile was ice cold. "You're not sorry. You're reacting. There's a difference." The CEO exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. "Walter, you know how these things work. A situation gets blown out of proportion online, and suddenly it's a PR nightmare. I have no doubt that my team will resolve this quickly." Walter's voice remained quiet, but there was steel underneath it. "You're worried about the wrong thing, Richard. The problem isn't just the headlines. It's the fact that your company's policies allowed this to happen in the first place." Before Coleman could respond, a younger executive leaned forward, adjusting his tie. "Mr. Whitmore, we understand your frustration, but surely you can appreciate that these are isolated incidents." Walter didn't let him finish. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, sliding it across the table. The screen was open to a trending social media post. Video footage of Charlotte Kramer's words, captured by a passenger who had been sitting nearby. Ezra watched as Coleman's expression changed. His jaw tightened. The room fell into silence as the executive saw exactly what had been posted. "I only did what we were trained to do. First class isn't for everyone." The video had already been shared thousands of times. News outlets had picked it up. Advocacy groups were tagging the airline, demanding accountability. Coleman clenched his hands together, his eyes flicking toward one of the communications directors. "What's the status?" The woman hesitated. "We're containing it," she said, "but it's spreading fast." Coleman exhaled sharply and turned back to Walter. "And what exactly do you want?" Walter leaned back in his chair, finally at ease. "That depends. You have two options. One, you try to bury this, claim it was just one employee acting on her own, maybe issue a half-hearted apology. That'll work for a little while, until people start digging deeper, until more customers come forward, until your stockholders start to ask why your numbers are slipping." Ezra watched as the room grew colder. He saw the way the executives shifted in their seats, exchanging glances, silently calculating what this meant for them. Walter continued, or two, you acknowledge what's been happening. You make real changes, new policies, real accountability, and you fix the problem before it destroys your company from the inside out. A heavy silence settled over the room. Then one of the executives, a gray-haired man sitting near the head of the table, scoffed. You're making threats now? Walter smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I don't make threats, he said. I make decisions. And right now, I'm offering you a chance to make the right one. Coleman rubbed his jaw, staring at the folder in front of him. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Everyone knew what was happening. The question was, would they act on it? Finally, Coleman let out a slow breath. We'll need time to discuss this internally. Walter stood. Of course, take all the time you need. He retrieved his phone from the table, slipping it back into his pocket. But just so we're clear, he added, the world isn't waiting for your response. With that, he turned and gestured for Ezra to follow. The boy did, stepping in stride with his father as they walked out of the boardroom. As the doors closed behind them, Ezra released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. So, what happens now? He asked. Walter didn't break stride. Now, he said, we make sure they don't have a choice. Ezra had never thought of himself as someone who could change the world. That was something his father did, through strategy, through influence, through the quiet power he carried in every boardroom he stepped into. But now, sitting across from Walter in their Los Angeles hotel suite, Ezra felt something shift inside him. The news was everywhere. Clips of Charlotte Kramer's words had been shared millions of times. Talking heads debated what it meant. Some dismissed it as an isolated incident. Others called it a reflection of something deeper, something that had been ignored for far too long. And then there was the phone call. Walter had taken it, listening with his usual calm. But when he hung up, he turned to Ezra with an unreadable expression. That was a journalist from the New York Times, he said. They want to speak with you. Ezra froze. Me? Walter nodded. They think your perspective is important. They want to hear the story from you, in your own words. Ezra's first instinct was to say no, to let his father handle it like he handled everything else. But then he thought about that moment on the plane, the way Charlotte had looked at him, the way the other passengers had whispered, the way security had reached for him without hesitation. He thought about every time someone had questioned him, made him feel like he had to prove he belonged. His fingers curled into fists. Bo lua noirang kwayan luk lajethai, joy the gyoy, he murmured. If I don't speak up now, then I'm letting them decide how this story's told. I'm letting them win. Walter studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled. Then say what you need to say. The interview was scheduled for the next morning. A journalist named Lisa Davenport arrived at the hotel, her demeanor professional but kind, her notebook balanced on her knee as she settled into the chair across from Ezra. A small recorder sat between them on the coffee table. Ezra took a deep breath. Whenever you're ready, Lisa said. So he began. At first, he simply recounted the facts, the boarding pass, the questioning, the way Charlotte had dismissed him before even checking. But then, as he spoke, he found himself saying more. I knew something was wrong the second she looked at me, he admitted. I could tell she had already decided I didn't belong there. And I didn't know what to do, because no matter what I said, I felt like it wouldn't matter. Lisa nodded, letting him continue. It's not just about what happened on the plane, Ezra said. It's about every time I've had to prove that I belong. Every time someone's looked at me like I shouldn't be where I am. Every time I felt like I had to be extra polite, extra careful, just to make sure no one got the wrong idea about me. He hesitated, then added, I don't want anyone else to feel that way. Lisa gave him an encouraging look. What do you hope comes from this? Ezra didn't even have to think. I just want a day where a kid like me can walk into first class and no one questions why he's there. The interview lasted just under an hour, but by the time it was over, Ezra felt like something had shifted. This was no longer just his father's fight. It was his too. The article was published the next day, and it exploded. It wasn't just a news story anymore. It was a movement. Celebrities began sharing the article. adding their own experiences or messages of support. Civil rights organizations demanded Liberty Airways make immediate changes. The conversation wasn't just about Ezra anymore. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Then came the breaking news. Liberty Airways issued a statement, terse and corporate, but unmistakable in its message. Effective immediately, Charlotte Kramer is no longer an employee of Liberty Airways. The company does not condone discrimination in any form and remains committed to an inclusive travel experience for all passengers. Ezra read the statement on his phone, his heart pounding. He looked up at his father. So, it's over? Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the window, staring out at the Los Angeles skyline, his hands in his pockets. Not yet, he said finally. We've only made them acknowledge the problem. Now we have to make sure they actually fix it. Ezra followed his gaze, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He understood exactly what his father meant. Liberty Airways was trying to clean up its mess, or at least that's how they wanted the public to see it. Their statement about Charlotte Kramer's termination had been carefully worded, concise, professional, and completely devoid of any real accountability. They had promised an internal review, a commitment to better training, and inclusive policies. But Walter had been in this game long enough to know what that really meant. Delay, deflect. Let the public outrage burn out, then go back to business as usual. Except this time, Walter wasn't going to let that happen. The phone call came late in the afternoon. He recognized the voice instantly. Mr. Whitmore, I believe we need to talk. Thomas Reynolds. Reynolds had been with Liberty Airways for years, one of the company's most influential executives. He wasn't the CEO, Richard Coleman was still the public face of the airline, but everyone knew who really pulled the strings behind the scenes. If Coleman was the diplomat, Reynolds was the enforcer. Walter leaned back in his chair, glancing toward the window of his Los Angeles office. The city stretched out beneath him, golden in the evening light. I assume this is about more than just small talk, Walter said. A pause. Then Reynolds let out a smooth chuckle. Of course, we'd prefer to discuss this in person. Are you free for dinner? Beverly Hills, private club, a place where men like us can speak freely. Walter recognized the move for what it was, a power play. Reynolds wanted to meet on his own turf, where the atmosphere itself whispered privilege and exclusivity. Walter smiled faintly. I'll see you there. The club was exactly what Walter expected. Dimly lit, exclusive, and full of men who had never heard the word no in their entire careers. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved soundlessly between tables, serving glasses of bourbon and plates of steak cooked to perfection. Conversations were hushed, the kind of murmured deals that decided the fate of industries. Reynolds was already waiting in a private lounge, nursing a drink. He looked exactly as Walter remembered, polished, confident, and utterly sure of himself. Whitmore, Reynolds greeted, rising slightly as Walter entered. Glad you could make it. Walter took his seat, nodding toward the glass in Reynolds' hand. That meant to loosen me up. Reynolds chuckled. No harm in a friendly drink between businessmen. Walter didn't reach for the menu. He wasn't here for the food. Let's skip the pleasantries, he said. You didn't invite me here for small talk. Reynolds swirled the amber liquid in his glass. You've made quite a lot of noise, Whitmore. More than I expected. People tend to listen when they hear the truth. Reynolds smirked. Truth? Or just a well-constructed narrative? Either way, you got what you wanted. Kramer is gone. Liberty has promised a review, and your son is now a public symbol of resilience. He took a slow sip, then set his glass down. So why keep pushing? Walter met his gaze without blinking. Because you and I both know this isn't about one flight attendant. It's about the culture you and your colleagues built. Reynolds sighed, shaking his head. You're smart, Walter. You know how these things work. Change is an instant, and it doesn't come from forcing a corporation into the corner. It happens quietly behind closed doors. What you're doing, stirring up the media, forcing our hand, you're making it harder for us to manage this the right way. Walter smiled, slow and knowing. And what exactly is the right way, Reynolds? Reynolds leaned forward slightly. We can find a way to resolve this without further damage. A settlement, a gesture of goodwill. Your family avoids unnecessary stress, and in return, we all move forward. Walter let the words hang in the air for a moment. Let me make sure I understand, he said, voice even. You're offering me money to walk away. Reynolds didn't flinch. Compensation. A way to smooth things over. No lawsuits, no further headlines. And we ensure that Liberty Airways continues to thrive. You don't want to see the company collapse, do you? Walter's fingers drummed lightly against the table. I don't want Liberty Airways to collapse, he said. I want it to change. Reynolds' expression darkened, just slightly. The polite mask cracked. You're a businessman, Whitmore. You understand power, and you understand that even men like you have limits. Walter tilted his head. Men like me? Reynolds' smirk returned, but it was colder now. You've made a lot of powerful people uncomfortable. You think they'll just let that slide? Walter exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make Reynolds listen. You think I haven't dealt with men like you before? Walter said. You think I don't know exactly how far you're willing to go? Reynolds didn't respond, but his grip on his glass tightened ever so slightly. Walter continued, his voice calm, controlled. I've spent my career building companies, investing in systems that work, and tearing down the ones that don't. You think I'm a problem? You haven't even seen what happens when I decide to solve one. A flicker of something crossed Reynolds' face. Uncertainty, irritation, maybe even a little fear. Walter pushed his chair back, standing with the same quiet confidence he always carried. Enjoy your drink, Reynolds. Reynolds forced a smile. Watch yourself, Whitmore. You're playing in dangerous waters. Walter's expression didn't change. I'm not the one who should be worried. Outside, the night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic. Walter pulled out his phone and dialed a number. A voice answered immediately. What's next? Walter glanced back at the club, then toward the city stretching out before him. Call the other investor, he said. It's time they heard what kind of business they're really supporting. He hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Ezra had asked him earlier if this fight was over. Walter had told him the truth. It was just getting started. Liberty Airways was moving fast. Too fast. Barely a week had passed since Walter's confrontation with Thomas Reynolds, and already the airline had announced a major press conference. The official statement was polished, carefully worded to sound both apologetic and forward-thinking. Liberty Airways is committed to fostering an inclusive and equitable travel experience. In response to recent events, we will be holding a press conference to outline our next steps toward ensuring fairness for all passengers. It was the kind of statement that corporations loved. Just enough accountability to sound sincere, just vague enough to avoid real commitment. Then came the part that surprised Walter. We invite Mr. Walter Whitmore to join us as we take this important step forward. The moment the announcement went public, Walter's phone exploded with messages. Some from reporters looking for a comment, others from business associates wondering if he'd been given any inside information. But there was nothing. Liberty Airways had extended the invitation, but not a single word about what they planned to say. That alone told Walter everything he needed to know. The conference was held in one of Los Angeles' most prestigious hotels, a grand ballroom packed with journalists, industry insiders, and Liberty Airways executives. The stage was set perfectly. Sleek podiums, bright white backdrops emblazoned with the company's logo, and a row of microphones lined up with precision. The air buzzed with quiet conversations, the type that always precede something big. Walter walked in with the same unshakable calm he carried everywhere. Ezra was beside him, his eyes scanning the room. He had been quiet all morning, but Walter knew his son well enough to sense the frustration simmering beneath the surface. At the front of the stage stood Richard Coleman, the CEO, looking as polished as ever. But it wasn't him that caught Walter's attention. It was Thomas Reynolds. The man stood just a step behind Coleman, arms crossed, exuding confidence. The way he carried himself, the slight smirk at the corner of his mouth, it was clear. This wasn't an apology. It was a trap. The room hushed as Coleman stepped up to the podium. Good afternoon, everyone, he began, his tone smooth, practiced. We at Liberty Airways recognize the concerns that have been raised in recent days. We acknowledge that our response must go beyond words, and today we are here to present our plan for real change. Ezra leaned slightly toward Walter. Do you think they actually mean that? Walter didn't answer. He already knew the answer. Coleman continued. To ensure accountability, we are announcing the formation of an internal oversight committee. This committee will review all customer service policies, provide bias training for employees, and ensure that all passengers are treated with fairness and respect. The room responded with polite nods. It was the kind of corporate move that made for good headlines but changed very little. Then came the shift. Reynolds stepped forward, taking the microphone. And while we remain committed to these principles, he said, his voice measured, we also want to address another concern. Walter tensed. Reynolds continued. In times like these, it's easy for emotions to run high. We understand that the public is passionate about fairness. But we must also be mindful of misinformation, of narratives that do not fully reflect the truth. A calculated pause, then, we regret that some individuals have chosen to use this incident as a means to destabilize our company, to turn what should be a moment of unity into one of division. Ezra's grip on the chair beside him tightened. They're blaming you, he muttered under his breath. Reynolds wasn't finished. Liberty Airways has always stood for fairness and excellence, he said, and we encourage our valued customers not to be swayed by reactionary claims or misleading portrayals of our company. The message was clear. They were painting Walter as a man stirring chaos for personal gain. Ezra turned to his father, his voice tense. This is wrong. They're trying to make you the villain. Walter didn't react. He simply watched, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned slightly toward Ezra, lowering his voice. Let them play their game, he murmured. We'll play ours. Ezra's eyes flickered with confusion. But before he could ask what his father meant, Walter was already moving. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped out a message. It was short. Ready? Let's show them what's happening behind the curtain. Then he slipped his phone back into his jacket and returned his attention to the stage, his expression unreadable. The game had just begun. Walter Whitmore never believed in playing defense. If someone tried to corner him, he made sure they regretted it. The moment Liberty Airways ended their press conference, his next move was already in motion. While Coleman and Reynolds had stood in front of cameras, trying to manipulate the public narrative, Walter had been orchestrating something far more powerful, the truth. Sitting in his office, he tapped a series of messages on his phone, sending encrypted files to a select group of journalists he trusted. Inside those files were years of data, internal complaints, ignored incident reports, and policy documents that hinted at a system designed to favor certain passengers over others. He didn't need to say much in his email. The evidence spoke for itself. This is bigger than one incident. This is systemic. You know what to do. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Liberty Airways faces accusations of long-standing discrimination. New documents reveal pattern of racial bias in first-class service. Passengers speak out. This happened to me too. CNN aired a segment where former flight attendants anonymously confirmed what Walter had exposed, training practices that subtly encouraged maintaining the first-class experience, a phrase that, in practice, meant keeping non-white passengers under closer scrutiny. The New York Times ran an investigative piece detailing how similar complaints had been dismissed for years, with canned responses and minimal action. The Washington Post published an op-ed questioning whether Liberty Airways' so-called reforms were just another corporate PR move. And then there was social media. People flooded Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook with their own stories. Black, Hispanic, and Middle Eastern travelers came forward, sharing experiences eerily similar to Ezra's. Some had been questioned about their seats. Others had been denied upgrades despite having the necessary rewards points. A movement was growing. Outside Liberty Airways headquarters, a crowd had gathered, holding signs demanding accountability. Chants echoed through the streets. No more excuses. Liberty for who? Change the system, not the headline. It wasn't just Walter and Ezra fighting. It was everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Inside Liberty Airways, panic was setting in. The executive boardroom was tense. The air was thick with frustration as Thomas Reynolds paced near the window, checking his phone every few minutes. Across the table, Richard Coleman looked exhausted, rubbing his temples as he reviewed the latest reports. Reynolds slammed his fist against the table. This was supposed to put the fire out, not throw gasoline on it. A PR executive, looking pale, hesitated before speaking. We underestimated how quickly this would escalate. The stock is down nearly 5%, and some investors are concerned. Concerned? Reynolds scoffed. They're looking for a way out, you mean? Coleman finally looked up. What's our next move? Silence. No one had an answer. Another executive hesitated before clearing his throat. Some of our major investors want reassurance. They're asking whether we should consider... He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Reynolds' face darkened. They're questioning my position, aren't they? No one spoke. Coleman sighed. If we don't contain this, the board will make their decision for us. Reynolds looked uncertain. At home, Ezra sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, stunned by the messages flooding his inbox. Some were from strangers, people thanking him for speaking up. Others were from kids his age, Black boys, Latino kids, even a few Asian and Middle Eastern students, all sharing the same kind of experiences. Being watched in stores, getting questioned about whether they were in the right place, teachers assuming they weren't honor students. Ezra swallowed hard. He had known this wasn't just about him, but seeing the sheer number of messages, knowing how many people had gone through the same thing and stayed silent, that made it real. His father walked into the room, setting his laptop aside. He gave Ezra a long look, studying him. You okay? Ezra nodded slowly. Yeah, it's just a lot. Walter sat beside him. You don't have to carry all of it, you know. Ezra exhaled. I know, but I want to do something. He glanced at his phone again. I don't want this to be just another news story people forget about in a week. Walter gave him a small smile. Then we make sure they don't forget. Before Ezra could ask what he meant, Walter's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then stood up. I need to take this. Ezra watched as his father stepped into his office, closing the door behind him. Walter picked up the call. A deep voice greeted him. Walter, it's Jonathan Caldwell. Walter leaned against his desk, recognizing the name immediately. Caldwell was one of the largest private investors in Liberty Airways, an old money billionaire who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. Jonathan, Walter said, keeping his tone neutral. To what do I owe the pleasure? A brief pause. Then Caldwell got straight to the point. You and I both know this company won't change unless it's forced to, and I'm starting to think forcing it might be the best option. Walter's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm listening. Caldwell sighed. There's another way to make real change, but it's not easy, and it's not quick. If you really want to fix this company, I suggest we talk about something bigger than just public pressure. Walter sat down, his fingers steepling as he considered the possibilities. Finally, he said, Go on. Walter sat in the quiet of his office, staring at the email on his screen. The offer was clear. A group of high-profile investors, frustrated with how Liberty Airways had mishandled the crisis, wanted him on the board. It was a position of power, a direct seat at the table, but it was also a battlefield. He could already hear Ezra's voice in his head, skeptical yet hopeful. Do you really think you can change something that's already rotten from the inside? Walter leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. He had spent years tearing down corrupt systems, but now he had a chance to fix one. The real question was whether Liberty Airways was worth saving. The next morning, he walked into a private conference room at one of Los Angeles' most exclusive business towers. Seated across from him, as expected, was Thomas Reynolds. Reynolds was under pressure. Walter could see it in the way his usually impeccable suit looked slightly less crisp, in the way his fingers tapped idly against the table, as if trying to mask his frustration. Still, the man wore a smirk. Whitmore, Reynolds greeted, leaning back in his chair. I suppose congratulations are in order. You've certainly shaken things up. Walter didn't respond. He simply met Reynolds' gaze, waiting. Reynolds exhaled, shaking his head. Let's be honest. This little war of yours has been good for headlines, but bad for business. You and I both know Liberty Airways can't survive a long-term scandal. So let's talk about a solution that works for everyone. Walter arched an eyebrow. I'm listening. Reynolds leaned forward slightly. You take the board seat. You get a say in policy, a voice in company decisions. But in return, you step back from the public fight. No more leaks to the press. No more rallies outside our headquarters. We handle this internally, gradually, without tearing the company apart. Walter let the words hang between them for a moment. Then he chuckled, shaking his head. You still don't get it, do you? He said, his voice even. Reynolds frowned slightly. Walter leaned forward now, his tone calm but firm. If you think I've spent all this time just to make a little noise and walk away with a title, then you don't understand me at all. Reynolds opened his mouth, but Walter wasn't finished. You want me on the board? Fine. But here's the deal. I want full control over customer service policy and flight crew training. No half measures, no watered-down initiatives. We rewrite how this company treats its passengers from the ground up. Reynolds' smirk twitched slightly, but Walter saw the hesitation in his eyes. You're asking for too much. Walter tilted his head. No, I'm asking for exactly what this company needs if it wants to survive. Silence. Reynolds exhaled, rubbing his temple. The board won't like it. Walter smiled faintly. Then they can decide if they'd rather deal with me from the inside or from the outside. Either way, this change is happening. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. Then finally he gave a slow nod. I'll make the arrangements. Later that evening, Walter and Ezra sat together in their living room, the day's events still settling between them. Ezra stared at the document on the table, the official agreement naming Walter Whitmore as the newest member of the Liberty Airways Board of Directors. You really did it, Ezra murmured. Walter nodded. This isn't just about winning, Ezra. It's about making sure no one else has to fight this battle again. Ezra glanced up at him, something shifting in his expression. He admitted, I actually believe that might be possible. Walter smiled, reaching for the pen. Then with a firm stroke, he signed his name. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Walter had never been one to waste time. The moment he secured his seat on the board of Liberty Airways, he went straight to work. His first demand was non-negotiable, a complete overhaul of the airline's customer service policies. That meant eliminating the unspoken biases in the training manual. That meant a new set of guidelines that didn't just suggest equal treatment, but enforced it. That meant retraining every single flight attendant, from rookies to veterans, making it clear that the era of traditional first-class passengers was over. And unsurprisingly, it didn't sit well with everyone. The pushback came fast. At the next board meeting, the resistance was clear before a single word was spoken. Thomas Reynolds sat with his arms crossed, expression tight. Other board members shifted in their seats, some whispering to each other, others scrolling through their phones as if to distance themselves from the tension in the room. Walter remained calm. He had faced worse. These policy changes aren't optional, Walter said, placing a thick report on the table. They're necessary. If Liberty Airways wants to survive, we need to move forward, not cling to the past. Reynolds let out a short laugh. Survive? We've been doing just fine. You think a little controversy changes that? Walter leaned forward slightly, voice measured. You're right. Controversies come and go. But this isn't just a controversy. This is about the brand, the customers, the investors, and whether they believe Liberty Airways represents the future or a company stuck in the past. A murmur spread through the room. One of the older board members, a woman named Diane Parker, adjusted her glasses and spoke carefully. Walter, I understand your concerns, but this kind of rapid overhaul, it could disrupt operations. We need to move cautiously. Walter nodded. Caution is good. Complacency is not. Reynolds smirked. And if the majority of this board disagrees with your plan? Walter didn't blink. Then I'll make sure the public knows exactly who's standing in the way of progress. Silence. Reynolds' smirk twitched slightly, but he didn't respond. The message was clear. This wasn't a private fight anymore. The world was watching, but Reynolds wasn't done fighting. Over the next few weeks, he quietly rallied the more conservative board members. He argued that Walter's approach was too aggressive, that it was politicizing the company. Then came the leak. A memo, supposedly from Walter's office, was leaked to a major business publication, painting him as a radical trying to force diversity quotas into hiring and customer service policies. The article questioned whether Liberty Airways was caving to pressure instead of focusing on quality service. Walter recognized the play immediately. It was meant to make him look like the one destabilizing the company. It was meant to stir resentment among longtime employees who were wary of change. And for a moment, it seemed to be working. Some of the senior flight attendants voiced concerns. A few pilots made anonymous statements to the press about how corporate politics were interfering with their jobs. Reynolds was banking on one thing, that the fear of change would outweigh the demand for justice. But he had underestimated something. The people were no longer on his side. As the internal battle raged on, the public pressure intensified. A growing number of high-profile customers, celebrities, executives, and longtime business travelers announced they were boycotting Liberty Airways unless real changes were made. Social media erupted, demanding updates on Walter's reforms. News outlets kept the pressure on, tracking every vote in the boardroom. And then, in the midst of it all, Ezra decided to step up. The community event was held in downtown Los Angeles, a gathering organized by civil rights groups and advocacy organizations. Walter hadn't expected to speak that day. He had planned to simply observe, but when the microphone was passed around, Ezra stood up. Walter blinked in surprise as his son walked to the front of the crowd. He hadn't prepared a speech. He hadn't asked for permission. But he spoke anyway. When I got on that plane, I wasn't thinking about race. I wasn't thinking about history or power or injustice. I was just a kid, excited for his flight. The audience was silent, listening. But before I even sat down, someone decided I didn't belong. Ezra took a slow breath, glancing at his father for just a second before continuing. And the thing is, that's not just about me. That's about every kid who's ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they have to prove they belong somewhere, that they have to be twice as good, twice as polite, twice as careful, just to be treated like everyone else. His voice was steady, strong. No one is born thinking they don't belong. The world teaches them that. A hush fell over the crowd. I don't want another kid to have to sit in that seat and feel like I did. The applause started slowly, then built into a roar. Within hours, Ezra's speech was viral. The next morning, a critical shift happened. One of the key board members, a longtime ally of Reynolds, suddenly changed his stance. Privately, he reached out to Walter. I've been on the fence about this, he admitted, but after hearing your son speak, I can't pretend we don't have a problem anymore. Walter had been fighting battles like this for years. He knew that real change wasn't about forcing people into a corner. It was about making them see the truth for themselves. And now the tide was turning. The final vote was coming. Walter knew that one last push would be all it took to bring down the old system for good. The boardroom of Liberty Airways had never been this tense. The air was thick with unspoken battles, silent calculations, and the weight of what was about to happen. The long mahogany table stretched between them, lined with the most powerful decision-makers in the company. At one end sat Richard Coleman, his expression unreadable. At the other sat Walter Whitmore, calm, collected, but sharp as ever. This was it, the moment that would decide the future of Liberty Airways. The meeting had been called under emergency conditions. Public pressure was mounting, stockholders were restless, and the airline's credibility was crumbling. Something had to be done. On the agenda, Walter's proposed reforms. If the board voted in favor, Liberty Airways would become the first airline in the nation to enforce a zero-tolerance policy on discrimination, with mandatory retraining and clear consequences for violations. If they rejected it, Walter could be voted out, and all his efforts would be erased overnight. Thomas Reynolds sat across from Walter, his suit crisp, his demeanor deceptively relaxed. But Walter could see it, the flicker of anxiety in his opponent's posture, the slight tension in his jaw. Reynolds was under pressure too, but that didn't stop him from attacking first. This, Reynolds said, leaning back in his chair, is an unnecessary upheaval of everything that's made this airline successful for decades. His voice was smooth, confident, designed to persuade, not argue. We built Liberty Airways on reliability, prestige, and a certain standard of service. That's why our most loyal customers continue to fly with us. And now, because of one highly publicized incident, we're considering throwing that away. A few board members nodded slightly, but they weren't entirely convinced. Reynolds continued, his voice carrying a calculated edge. Walter, I respect that you want to make a difference, but you are not from this industry. You don't understand the traditions that make an airline work. And quite frankly, it's reckless to let an outsider dictate how we run things. Silence followed. Walter didn't react. He didn't lean forward, didn't snap back with emotion. Instead, he calmly slid a folder across the table. Let's talk about what actually makes an airline successful, Walter said, voice measured. He tapped the folder. This contains data from our own internal reports, employee surveys over the last 3 years. It shows that the majority of younger employees, flight attendants, customer service representatives, even pilots, support a change in company culture. Many of them have already seen the problem firsthand. Reynolds frowned slightly but said nothing. Walter continued. This second report, he said, pulling out another document, shows our customer retention rates. Since this scandal broke, Liberty Airways has lost over 20% of its frequent flyers under the age of 45. That's a demographic worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the next decade. A few murmurs broke out. Some board members shifted uncomfortably. And finally, Walter said, pulling out the last document, this is an independent financial projection from one of our largest investment firms. If we fail to act now and public confidence continues to drop, our projected losses could exceed $300 million over the next 5 years. Now, even the board members who had been neutral were paying attention. Walter wasn't making this a moral debate. He was making it a business decision. And for corporate executives, that mattered more than anything else. The voting began. One by one, board members cast their votes. As expected, Reynolds led in the beginning. The old guard, the ones who clung to tradition, sided with him. But then, the shift happened. The impact of Ezra's speech, the relentless pressure from customers, the cold, hard financial numbers. One by one, board members changed their stance, until finally it came down to one last vote. Richard Coleman. The CEO had remained undecided throughout the process. He had seen both sides, weighed the risks, and now every eye in the room was on him. He exhaled slowly, looked at Reynolds, then looked at Walter. Then, without a word, he placed his vote. A brief silence. Then Coleman spoke, his voice carrying finality. Liberty Airways will move forward with Walter Whitmore's reform plan. The room shifted. Some board members exhaled in relief. Others muttered to themselves, already calculating their next steps. And Reynolds? Reynolds sat frozen for a moment, his fingers tightening into fists beneath the table. He had lost. Coleman turned to him, voice calm but firm. Thomas, your time here is done. Thomas Reynolds had no control over the room. Security was called to escort him out. Walter sat back in his chair, watching as Reynolds gathered his things, his face a mask of forced composure. As the doors closed behind him, a new era for Liberty Airways had begun. That night, Walter sat with Ezra in their living room, watching the news report the historic vote. Ezra turned to his father, his expression a mix of awe and understanding. You really did it. Walter exhaled, watching the city lights outside their window. We did it. Ezra smiled. He truly believed that the world could change if enough people were willing to fight for it. The news broke within hours of the vote. Liberty Airways officially announced the most significant overhaul of its customer service policies in the company's history. Every major media outlet covered it. Some called it a bold step forward. Others claimed it was a desperate attempt to save face. But one thing was clear. Change was happening. The official statement from Liberty Airways outlined the reforms. Mandatory anti-discrimination training for all employees, from executives to flight attendants. An independent oversight committee to monitor passenger complaints and ensure accountability. Transparent policies on seating upgrades and first-class service, eliminating hidden biases in the process. It wasn't just a public relations move. It was real. It was enforceable. And it was the first of its kind in the airline industry. Walter watched the announcement from his office, arms crossed. This wasn't just a win, it was a precedent. Other airlines would be forced to follow or risk public scrutiny. Ezra sat beside him, staring at the screen. So, this is really happening? Walter nodded. This is just the start. As expected, reactions were divided. Some passengers, especially those who had experienced similar discrimination, celebrated the decision. Social media was flooded with praise for Liberty Airways, finally acknowledging the issue and doing something about it. But others, especially the old-school business elite, were furious. This has gone too far, one angry caller ranted on a morning radio show. First, they attack a flight attendant for doing her job, and now they're turning an airline into a social experiment? A well-known conservative columnist published an op-ed accusing Liberty Airways of abandoning tradition in favor of political correctness. Walter expected it. He had seen it before. Change never came without resistance. What he didn't expect was how quickly other airlines started feeling the heat. By the end of the week, major competitors like Pacific Air and Orion Airways were being bombarded with questions. Will you be implementing similar reforms? How do you ensure your first-class passengers are treated fairly? Have your employees undergone racial bias training? Some tried to deflect. Others promised to review their policies. But the message was clear. This was no longer just Liberty Airways' problem. The industry was shifting. Meanwhile, Thomas Reynolds was facing the consequences of his downfall. His removal from the board had sent shockwaves through the business world. Investors distanced themselves. Longtime allies stopped returning his calls. He was out of power. A major news network aired an exclusive interview with him. The host didn't hold back. Mr. Reynolds, looking back, do you regret the way you handled this situation? Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair. He was older now. He looked it. I don't think I was wrong, he said finally. I just think the world has changed, and people like me, we don't belong in it anymore. A heavy silence followed. It was an admission of defeat, not in words but in resignation. Reynolds wasn't just out of Liberty Airways. He was out of his era. Back at home, Walter sat across from Ezra at the kitchen table. Things were quiet. No emergency meetings, no crisis to manage. Just them. Walter sipped his coffee before speaking. So, what do you think? Do you regret stepping into all of this? Ezra didn't hesitate. No, Dad. He shook his head, smiling. I just wish I had done it sooner. Walter studied him for a moment. The kid who had once been afraid to take up space, to challenge authority, now sat in front of him, unapologetic, confident, sure of himself. Walter reached across the table and squeezed his son's shoulder. You did good, kid. Ezra grinned. So did you. That night, Walter's phone buzzed with an unexpected message. An executive from Orion Airways, one of Liberty's biggest competitors, had reached out. We've been watching what you did at Liberty, the message read. We'd like to discuss bringing you on as a consultant. Help us do this the right way before we end up in the same mess. Walter leaned back, exhaling slowly. He had just finished one fight, and now a new door had opened. He smiled slightly, shaking his head. The work was never done. Ezra stood at the front of a small classroom, a place he never imagined himself just a year ago. The students in front of him, most of them young kids of color, watched him with curious eyes, some leaning forward, some looking down at their notebooks, unsure of what to expect. He took a breath, remembering how he used to feel in spaces like this, like he had to prove he belonged, but not anymore. When I stepped onto that plane, Ezra began, his voice steady, I wasn't expecting anything special. I just thought I was going to my seat, same as everyone else. But I learned that sometimes people see you a certain way before you even open your mouth. A few students nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. I used to think that if I was quiet enough, if I was polite enough, people would see me for who I was. But I realized something. They already decided who I was before I even said a word. And if I didn't speak up, they would keep deciding for me. A girl in the front row raised her hand. So what do we do? Ezra smiled. We make sure they hear us. The room was silent, but the energy had shifted. If you have a voice, use it, Ezra continued. If you have power, do the right thing. Because if you don't, someone else will decide your future for you. The applause wasn't loud, but it was real. Ezra felt something settle in his chest. Certainty. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was leading. Across town, Walter sat in a meeting room with a group of executives. Not Liberty Airways this time. This was a different company, a bigger one, with even more influence. "I'll be blunt," the CEO across from him said. "We don't want to be the next Liberty Airways. The industry is shifting, and we need to move with it. We need someone to help us do this the right way." Walter leaned back, studying the man. He had spent most of his life using his power to protect his family. But now he understood something even bigger. Power wasn't just for defense. It was for creating something better. "You want to change?" Walter asked. "Then you need to be ready to do more than just issue statements. You need to rebuild from the ground up." The CEO hesitated. "That's a big ask." Walter smiled slightly. "Then you're not ready for me." Silence. Then after a moment, the man nodded. "We'll do it your way." Meanwhile, Liberty Airways was undergoing one final shift. Richard Coleman had stepped down as CEO, his legacy tainted by years of looking the other way. In his place, the company appointed a younger, more progressive leader, someone who understood that the airline needed more than just a PR makeover. Walter had been offered the position. He turned it down. "I didn't come here to run an airline," he told the board. "I came here to change it, and now it's your job to make sure it stays changed." Instead, he remained a strategic advisor, ensuring that the new policies weren't just empty promises. Because Walter knew the truth. Winning a battle didn't mean winning the war. Ezra and Walter stood on the observation deck of the airport, watching as a Liberty Airways plane lifted off into the sky. This time, Ezra knew that every seat on that plane belonged to whoever paid for it, not just the ones who looked the part. Ezra turned to his father. "So, we won, right?" Walter looked out at the horizon, at the vastness beyond. "No, son," he said. "We just got started." Just then, Walter's phone buzzed. Another message, another request, another company, another fight, another system that needed to change. He smirked, shaking his head as he picked up the phone. "All right," he muttered to himself. "Let's see what we can fix next." Power isn't just about wealth or status. It's about what you choose to do with it. Walter Whitmore didn't just fight for his son. He fought to change a system that had gone unchecked for too long. And Ezra? He learned that his voice mattered, that standing up, even when it's uncomfortable, can spark something bigger than himself. But here's the real question. If you were in their shoes, would you have spoken up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in stories that challenge, inspire, and make a difference, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. Because this is just the beginning.